Podcast Talk.
Learn English naturally.
When every day looks the same.
There's a strange moment when you realize you don't remember yesterday clearly. Not because something bad happened, but because nothing stood out. You woke up, did what you always do, talked to people, finished tasks, went to bed. And today feels exactly the same. When days start blending together like that, it's not about boredom, it's about losing contrast. And once contrast disappears, time feels different.
What's unsettling about this sameness is how quietly it settles in. You don't wake up one day and notice it immediately. It shows up later when you try to recall a specific moment and realize everything blends together. I remember looking back at an entire week and struggling to name a single day that felt different. Not because nothing happened, but because everything followed the same rhythm. Work, messages, conversations, small routines repeating without interruption. And when life moves like that, the mind stops marking time. Days don't feel lived, they feel processed. That's when people start feeling tired without knowing why, because attention never fully lands anywhere.
I started noticing this pattern at work, actually. Meetings looked different on the calendar, but felt identical once they started. Same structure, same polite reactions, same conclusions. I remember finishing one call and immediately joining another, barely registering the shift. At some point, I realized I wasn't bored, Ethan. I was disengaged. My body was present, my answers were correct, but my attention had already moved on before the conversation ended. And when that happens repeatedly, days lose their edges.
I know exactly what you mean. I had a similar moment after a long workday when someone asked how it went. I couldn't answer beyond fine or busy, not because I didn't want to share, but because nothing felt specific enough to describe. It scared me a little. Work wasn't stressful, but it also wasn't memorable. And when large parts of your life become hard to describe, that sameness starts leaking into everything else.
And it doesn't stop at work. I noticed it on weekends, too. Plans looked different, but felt strangely familiar once I was there. Coffee, walks, conversations, all pleasant, but interchangeable. I remember thinking this should feel refreshing. Instead, it felt like a softer version of the week. That's when I realized sameness isn't about routine. It's about how little impact moments leave when you're constantly moving through them.
I had a moment recently that made this really clear for me. I was finishing a workday that wasn't difficult, just full. Meetings, emails, small decisions, all handled smoothly. And when I closed my laptop, I felt strangely empty. Not relieved, not stressed, just blank. I realized I couldn't name a single moment that actually stayed with me. Maya, it felt like the day passed through me without touching anything. And that's when it hit me. When every day looks the same, effort keeps happening, but meaning slowly steps aside.
I know that feeling you're describing, Ethan, because I've had evenings like that too. You finish everything you planned, technically succeed at the day, and still feel untouched by it. I remember standing in my kitchen doing the same small routines I do every night and realizing how automatic everything felt. Not wrong, not unpleasant, just empty of distinction. That's when I started asking myself whether I was actually living my days or simply completing them. And once that question appears, it's hard to ignore how often days repeat without leaving anything behind.
That question changes how you look at time. You stop measuring it by how full it is and start noticing how little of it stays with you. I caught myself trying to remember what made a recent week different, and all I could recall were tasks, not conversations, not moments, just responsibilities. And that's unsettling because it means life is happening mostly on the surface. When that becomes normal, it explains why days feel long while months disappear.
I think work plays a big role in that, even when we enjoy what we do. The structure is always similar, same tools, same rhythms, same expectations. I noticed how quickly my brain switched into efficiency mode. I stopped being curious about the process and focused only on finishing. And when curiosity fades, days start looking identical, even if the tasks themselves change.
I think one reason sameness feels so heavy is that we normalize it and call it adulthood. We tell ourselves stability is supposed to feel repetitive, and we stop expecting days to have personality. I remember a week where everything went smoothly at work. No drama, no emergencies, just steady productivity. And yet by Friday, I felt strangely worn out. Not from stress, but from the lack of contrast. When every day follows the same emotional volume, the mind stops marking time. Without strong moments, memory loses anchors and the week becomes a blur you can't describe.
I think the hardest part is that people don't realize when this sameness begins. It doesn't arrive loudly. There's no clear moment where everything breaks. Instead, days slowly start copying each other. You wake up, do what's expected, talk about the same things, and fall asleep feeling vaguely tired. The Not exhausted, just empty. I'm and when someone like you, Ethan, points it out, people often say, but nothing is wrong. And that's exactly the problem.
I've noticed that when every day looks the same, people stop asking themselves meaningful questions. They don't wonder what they're moving toward anymore. They just focus on getting through the day. Wake up, work, messages, small talk, sleep. None of it feels bad enough to escape, but none of it feels alive either. That's the dangerous part. When life isn't painful enough to change, but not meaningful enough to stay, people get stuck in quiet dissatisfaction. And from the outside, everything looks completely fine.
And what makes it worse is that society rewards this state. People praise consistency, stability, routine. They rarely ask whether that routine still fits the person living it. So when someone feels empty inside a good life, they assume the problem is personal. They think they should be more grateful, more motivated, more disciplined. But the truth is, repeating the same emotional day over and over slowly disconnects people from themselves. That's not laziness. That's emotional fatigue.
I think that's why people struggle to explain this feeling. There's no clear crisis, no dramatic event, just a quiet sense that time is passing without leaving a trace. Weeks blur together, memories fade faster than they should. And when someone asks how life is going, the easiest answer is fine. Not because it's true, but because explaining the emptiness feels harder than carrying it.
When people start answering fine automatically, it quietly reshapes how they experience time. Days stop having texture. Mornings don't feel different from evenings, and weeks blur together without clear edges. It's not that nothing happens. Things do happen. Meetings, conversations, small decisions. But they don't register emotionally. Without emotional registration, memory weakens. And when memory weakens, life begins to feel repetitive, even if the schedule changes. The sameness isn't external, it's internal, created by emotional disengagement.
I've seen how this shows up in the way people talk about their weeks. They summarize 7 days in one sentence. Busy. Same as usual. That compression is a sign. When experience can be compressed so easily, it usually means it wasn't fully felt. Fully felt moments resist simplification. They leave traces. Without those traces, time passes faster and people feel like life is moving without them.
What people rarely notice is how repetition slowly rewires attention. When days follow the same emotional pattern, the mind stops scanning for meaning. It switches to efficiency mode. You start moving through hours instead of experiencing them. Conversations feel familiar before they even begin. Reactions arrive automatically. Over time, this automatic living dulls curiosity. And once curiosity fades, even change feels unnecessary. That's how sameness becomes invisible while quietly taking over.
I've noticed that people often misread this numbness as peace. There's no drama, no urgency, no strong emotions. From the outside, everything looks stable. But stability without engagement slowly turns into distance. You're present physically, but absent internally. And the longer that gap stays open, the harder it becomes to remember what genuine interest felt like. That's when days begin to blur beyond recognition.
What makes repetition so hard to notice is that it doesn't arrive as a problem. It arrives as comfort. Familiar mornings, predictable conversations, routines that don't ask anything new from you. At first, that feels calming. But over time, comfort without contrast slowly erases awareness. You stop noticing small details. You stop feeling surprised by people. Even emotions begin to feel recycled. That's when days start to blend together. Not because nothing happens, but because everything feels emotionally similar. And when emotional contrast disappears, memory weakens. Life keeps moving, but it stops leaving marks.
I've seen how this shows up in real conversations. People describe entire weeks using one word: normal, same. That compression tells you something important. When experience can be reduced so easily, it usually means it wasn't fully lived. Fully lived moments resist shortcuts. They carry texture, emotion, and weight. Without that weight, time feels faster. And when time feels fast, people assume productivity. But speed without presence doesn't create meaning, it creates distance.
And that distance quietly changes how people relate to themselves. They stop checking in emotionally, they rely on routines to tell them who they are. Days become proof of function, not experience. And when identity is built on repetition alone, life starts to feel interchangeable. One day replaces another without resistance. And that's why sameness isn't solved by new plans or bigger goals. It's solved by restoring presence, by allowing moments to be felt again, not just completed.
What often goes unnoticed is how quickly people normalize emotional flatness. They don't call it numbness, they call it being realistic, responsible, focused. But realism without reflection slowly removes curiosity. You stop asking why things feel heavy or dull. You assume that's just how life is now. Over time, this acceptance becomes automatic. And once it's automatic, it stops being questioned, even when it quietly erodes motivation and presence. There's another layer to this sameness that people rarely talk about. It's how repetition slowly removes decision-making from daily life. When days look the same, choices disappear. You don't decide how to start the morning. You don't decide what deserves attention. You simply follow a pattern that already exists. Over time, that pattern becomes automatic. And once life runs automatically, awareness fades. People feel busy but not intentional, active but not present. That's when time feels fast, even though nothing meaningful seems to happen.
And the loss of choice affects emotions more than people expect. When you stop choosing, feelings become muted. Joy doesn't fully arrive. Frustration doesn't fully surface. Everything stays somewhere in the middle. That emotional middle feels calm, but it's actually numb. Without emotional highs and lows, memory weakens. Days don't stand out, weeks blur together. And when memory fades, people start questioning where their time went.
That's why people often try to fix sameness with external changes, new routines, new goals, new schedules. But if the internal experience doesn't change, repetition returns quickly. Different days, same feeling. The problem was never the calendar. It was the absence of engagement. Without engagement, variety stays superficial, and superficial variety can't restore a sense of aliveness.
What people often miss is how repetition slowly reshapes their sense of time. When days feel similar, the brain stops marking moments as important. You still remember events, but they don't carry emotional weight. Meetings happen, conversations happen, decisions are made, but nothing stands out strongly enough to be remembered later. Over time, this creates the feeling that weeks disappear without leaving a trace. People say time is flying, but what they really mean is that nothing is landing. Without emotional landing, memory weakens. And when memory weakens, life feels compressed. Days collapse into summaries. Busy, same as usual. That compression isn't efficiency, it's disengagement. Engagement slows time because it adds detail, it creates contrast, it gives moments shape. Without it, repetition doesn't just feel boring, it feels invisible. And invisible days are the ones people struggle to remember when they look back on their lives.
I think the most confusing part for people is that this kind of sameness doesn't feel dramatic. There's no clear moment when you can say, this is where everything went wrong. Life still looks functional. You show up. You respond. You do what's expected of you. But internally, something feels muted. The emotional range narrows. Excitement becomes rare. Frustration becomes quiet. And everything settles into a neutral middle. When that happens, days stop standing out. Not because they are identical, but because they are experienced the same way. And over time, that sameness creates distance, not just from life, but from yourself.
And that distance from yourself slowly changes how you move through the world. You stop reacting naturally and start responding predictably. Conversations follow familiar paths. Opinions sound rehearsed. Even laughter feels timed. When every day looks the same, emotionally, people protect themselves by staying within known patterns. It feels safer than risking surprise or disappointment. But safety without curiosity creates stagnation. And stagnation is what makes life feel repetitive, even when time keeps moving forward.
I think that's why change often feels harder than staying stuck. Change requires attention. It asks you to notice what you've been avoiding. Staying the same doesn't ask anything. It lets days pass quietly, but the cost of that quiet passing shows up later. People look back and realize time moved faster than expected. Not because life was full, but because nothing interrupted the pattern. That realization is often the first moment when sameness becomes visible.
And noticing that pattern doesn't mean something is broken, it means something wants attention. Repetition is a signal, not a failure. It tells you that presence has faded and needs to be restored, not through dramatic change, but through small shifts in awareness, paying attention to how moments feel, letting yourself experience contrast again. That's often enough to make days feel distinct, even without changing the schedule.